Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Carrie Ann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist practicing here in Massachusetts, and this is a talk show that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community. So if you have a question or comment at any point in time throughout the show, just leave a comment below in the comment section. So in today's show, I'm going to share with you the results of a research study that was looking at the top 6 ways that Black American women heal from trauma. Now, this was a study published in the Journal of Black Psychology, and the article is called Still I Rise: Resilience Factors Contributing to Post-Traumatic Growth in African American Women. The authors of the article were Dansha Mushanga, Shavila Rashim, and Darlene Anderson. And they focus in particular on African American women who have experienced intimate partner violence and also have a low income. That was their focus. And they investigated the factors that contributed to what's called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth. And so the most of what I'm going to discuss in the first half today is from this article. About 45% of African American women have experienced sexual or physical violence or stalking. 45%. And intimate partner violence is 35% higher in African American women than in white women. Intimate partner violence can lead to many mental health issues like depression, sleep problems, suicidality, anxiety. And African American women are also less likely to seek professional help. Now, interestingly, some studies have shown that African American women have a higher rate of this post-traumatic growth than other races. So interesting kind of combination: higher rate of post-traumatic growth, less likely to seek mental health services, more likely to experience intimate partner violence. So post-traumatic growth is resilience plus. So it includes resilience, but it also includes being able to make meaning out of your experiences and have a transformative change in your mindset. So women who have experienced post-traumatic growth have a greater appreciation of life, spiritual change, new possibilities, personal strength, and they can successfully relate to other people. And these particular factors that I just listed, they were used to create a scale called the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory. And that measures positive outcomes after trauma. Now, the study that I'm going to talk to you about today did not use this inventory, but I just wanted to pause and say there are not very many tools that we use in psychiatry that measure positive things. Most of the tools that we use measure how sick a person is, how many symptoms a person has. Then you add it all up to kind of, measure if somebody meets criteria for an illness. And the post-traumatic growth inventory is a measure of growth and positive change, which I think is just really great. So I just wanted to kind of pause and acknowledge that we have a scale that measures good things, growth and positive change. So the study that I want to talk to you about, it's important for me to kind of just lay the foundation for it. It enrolled 8 women. So it was only 8 women. And the age range was pretty wide. It was from age, these women ranged from age 24 to age 47. So that is significant because a woman who's 24 is in a different developmental stage of life than a woman who is twice their age, almost 48. So the age range was pretty wide, and it was 8 women. They recruited the women for the study from a shelter. So these women resided in a shelter, and they did not have a stable income. And as I mentioned before, this population had intimate partner violence. So these 8 women had all experienced intimate partner violence within the last year, and most of them had experienced it within the last 6 months. And that included things like physical assault, assault with a weapon, sexual assault, and unexpected death of a friend or family member. In terms of the income, 7 out of the 8 participants reported an annual income below $10,000 a year. And the 8th participant reported an income that was between $10,000 and $15,000 a year. Notably, 7 out of the 8 of them had received previous mental health services. And most of them felt like they were supported by family members, their church community, and their mental health providers. So these are the women who were kind of interviewed for this study. And now I want to go into the 6 major ways that these women reported experiencing post-traumatic growth. So this was kind of the conclusion of what this study found. So the 6 ways. Number 1 was spirituality. Maybe not a surprise, but spirituality was one of the ways. So most of the group members relied on their faith and relied on their church community when they experienced trauma. They tended to feel closer to God. They experienced a personal relationship with God and would ask Him to help them get through the day. Being in church helped them to release their emotional burdens. Now, some of them also went through the process of a crisis of faith, wondering why God would allow trauma to happen to them. But they could bring these kinds of questions with them when they prayed, and they could find a spiritual and psychological resolution to these tough questions. And on this show, we've spoken before about the role of the church in the Black community. So many of our religious leaders have partnered with mental health providers to kind of unite and provide the help and resources that people need in the congregation. So connecting with your minister could be a great step. Of course, not all churches are the same. Not all ministers are receptive to the work of mental health providers. So, it's not universal. But overall, the group of women in this study found their church community to be helpful. So number 1 was spirituality. Number 2 was motherhood. Motherhood. 7 out of the 8 participants in the study were mothers. And so they said that their desire to be a better mother and also the relationships that they developed with other mothers were very helpful to them. They wanted to protect their children. They wanted to prevent them from experiencing the same things that they went through. And they wanted to use their experiences as like teaching opportunities for their children. So being a mother was a powerful factor for meaning making in life. And for most of these women, it did contribute to their post-traumatic growth. So spirituality and motherhood. Number 3 was gratitude. 6 out of the 8 participants felt that they had reasons to be grateful. Some of them expressed that things could have been worse. They were thankful to have the shelter. They were thankful to have a safe place for themselves and for their children. They were grateful to have clothes. They were kind of noted that other people didn't have access to the things they had access to. They would kind of say that they were grateful to be free of the violent situation that they were in before. They used words like lucky to describe themselves. They would say that they were blessed beyond measure was another quote. So that was important for post-traumatic growth. So, for those of you out there that are listening, what are you grateful for? Gratefulness can help you with post-traumatic growth. Okay, so spirituality, motherhood, and gratitude. Number 4 is prudence. Prudence. Now, prudence is having caution with practical things and taking care with how you manage resources. To be prudent is to be wise and judicious and careful in providing for the future. So 7 out of the 8 women spoke about how their past experiences would shape future decision making. In particular, they had to learn how to discern the right people to trust. They had to have the experience of observing, what can go wrong when they trusted the wrong people. So this one about prudence is about trust. And it's an interesting factor, okay? From my experience working with individuals that have experienced trauma, it can be extremely difficult for a person to know who to trust. In fact, even for people who have not experienced this kind of trauma, it can still be difficult to know who to trust. I mean, any of us can probably, give a story of a person that they thought was trustworthy and they found out they were not trustworthy. So it can be really, really difficult to know who to trust. And it can get quite confusing. I've worked with women in the past who they thought they were being really, really careful. But they ended up, again, with a partner that had the same outcome of abuse or violence. There's something about interpersonal trauma that can kind of sensitize us to forming new relationships. So we get really cautious about forming new relationships. But something about the experience also creates a lot of psychological and emotional confusion about who to trust. So, there's a lot of, I don't want to trust anybody, but then who should I trust? Knowing who to trust, there's a lot of confusion about that. And so it can be really difficult to not overshoot on the side of just complete mistrust. And it's, this was an interesting point because it's absolutely important to be discerning about who to trust and to be careful about those future connections. It's important for your safety, but it can be difficult to balance. So I'd be interested to know if anybody that's listening has thoughts about this as being a factor for post-traumatic growth, this idea of mistrust. So the authors of the study refer to this one as a contradictory theme because prudence is essentially mistrust. And so can mistrust be a factor for post-traumatic growth? Okay, because it's kind of an overcompensation. But interestingly, it can be reframed. So the study also brings up the concept of prudence as self-preservation. Okay, and self-preservation is a type of survival strategy, and it's a type of empowerment. So what we have is prudence, which if it's kind of overdone, you're just overly mistrustful of everyone. But it can also be reframed as self-preservation, which is for survival and is a type of empowerment. So interesting kind of thing. But remember, this is kind of just a theme that they got from interviewing these 8 women. This is what these women cited as the factors that helped them to move forward after their trauma. So prudence was one. Number 5 was solitude. 5 out of the 8 women tended to prefer to be alone, especially if their environment added to their stress level. So they limited their interactions and they tended to keep to themselves. So again, I ask you, for those that are listening, what do you think about the idea of post-traumatic adaptation to be solitude, to be limiting your interactions and kind of keeping to yourself? Okay, does solitude lead to post-traumatic growth? So again, this is another one of the themes that the authors refer to as a contradictory theme. Okay, it's a kind of overcompensation, and it's a kind of avoidance. Solitude can be a type of avoidance. But on the other hand, taking some time of solitude can give you time to reduce all those external stressors and to limit the stimulation that you let into your life. And you can spend time in introspection and self-reflection. And there is some evidence that people who feel comfortable being alone experience less depression and have more life satisfaction. However, social isolation can also contribute to loneliness, and that can lead to depression, and loneliness and depression can cause people to make bad decisions in relationships. They can end up in another bad relationship. So this is another one where I think, okay, on one hand, solitude could be helpful for time for reflection and introspection and kind of staying away from things that could be harmful. But on the other hand, it could be avoidant, and it could be, an overcompensation, and it could lead to loneliness and other problems. So, I'd be interested to know what you think. Can solitude lead to post-traumatic growth? Now, again, these were the answers for these 8 women in this study. Number 6 is selective attention. So 6 out of the 8 participants said that they actively tried to not think about the trauma on a regular basis. They made efforts to move past it without dwelling on it too much. They basically tried to suppress the thoughts. So that was the 6th thing that the women in this study did. They said, I just try not to think about it. I try to suppress the thoughts. And most of them cited that as a factor that helped them in their post-traumatic kind of growth. This is another one of those contradictory themes. Okay, so selective attention, or basically suppressing the thoughts of the trauma, were used because of how intrusive trauma memories can be. Trauma memories are very intrusive. And so they found that over time, these women were able to experience fewer thoughts about their trauma. So it kind of worked, right? When they suppressed it, it kind of worked. They kind of had less thoughts about their trauma. But I would just add in here that one of the benefits of meeting with a mental health professional is that you have a place to bring these thoughts to. I can't imagine if you're just trying to suppress these thoughts all the time and you don't have a place to bring them to. And a therapist would be such a place to bring those thoughts to. So these were their experiences, their thoughts, their strategies. It helped them to be able to continue functioning and moving ahead with their lives. Post-traumatic growth is strongly associated with perception, okay? And in reality, people will always use a combination of great strategies and maybe not so great strategies. That's just how life is. All of us are like this. We'll have a combination of things that are very good and effective and other things that maybe might not be the best way to handle something, but somehow the net effect is that we keep moving forward. In particular, some of the more avoidant strategies, like trying not to think about the thoughts, or just trying to, be by yourself and not be around other people. Some of that could be reframed as self-reliance. And even though there is a risk of overcompensating with self-reliance, like an extreme self-reliance, if you're able to balance things just right, self-reliance can actually be a very important part of post-traumatic growth. Okay. And it kind of brings up this idea of what post-traumatic growth looks like for Black women versus, just a universal thing, because some of these women's answers did not completely match the existing research for what factors are part of post-traumatic growth. And so what I want to talk about in the second half is what are the factors of post-traumatic growth, and maybe kind of point out where some of these women's answers were maybe slightly different. But I just want to also say self-reliance, particularly in this particular population that was examined in the study, these women that are in a shelter, they have their income is not stable. They may or may not have the same access to services. Self-reliance may have a bigger role in post-traumatic growth for a person in that circumstance. So these are some of the adaptations where we think, okay, if you don't have the same resources, maybe some of these factors are going to kind of lean in one direction or the other direction. It still contributes to post-traumatic growth, but it just plays out differently depending on your circumstances. So, and as I mentioned too, this is just a very interesting kind of, examination, because in research, African-American women are often not specifically studied. So when they looked at post-traumatic growth, they just kind of published something that they thought was universal. And so it kind of then relies on other people to come behind that and say, okay, let's kind of design other studies specifically applying these principles to specific populations and seeing whether or not it holds up. So for the remainder of our time today, I wanted to talk more generally about recovery from trauma, because the idea of post-traumatic growth is very interesting and helpful. It's just that the research didn't specifically include Black American women. But post-traumatic growth can apply to anyone, okay? So there's another article, was written by Richard Tedeschi and Lauren Calhoun. It was in the journal Psychological Inquiry from back in 2004. They define post-traumatic growth as the experience of positive change that occurs as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life crises. And they just call it highly challenging life crises. Same thing as trauma, same thing as adversity. You can use whatever word you prefer, but highly challenging life circumstances. And there are many different kinds of trauma, of course. The study that I spoke about earlier was specifically for women who had experienced intimate partner violence and poverty and their particular set of life circumstances. But there are a range of things that can happen in a person's life that could be highly challenging and create a crisis. So I'm going to talk about the general post-traumatic growth. So of course, highly traumatic life experiences generally lead to distressing emotions. And as we try to cope with and recover from these experiences, our perspective evolves through that process of trying to recover and cope. Okay. So often the growth coexists with some level of disorder kind of at the same time, because we're coming out of the trauma. There's some amount of disorder and some amount of growth, and it's kind of both happening at the same time. Trauma has a way of showing us a different version of ourselves, but often in negative ways. So trauma kind of makes you see aspects of yourself you didn't know that you could display or present. It can shake you. It can bring things out in you. So you see this different version of yourself. And it kind of threatens to change who we are. It threatens to change who we are. But trauma can also bring you to a place of personal transformation. Because as you try to attempt to make sense of what you experienced and try to find ways to move forward, those efforts to survive lead to growth. And that's kind of the foundation for post-traumatic growth, is like this effort to survive after having experienced trauma, leading to a transformation in your mindset, in your perspective, and in your view of who you are. So, people often want to know, has anyone studied the folks that survive after experiencing trauma and studied resiliency factors? And yeah, people have studied resiliency. But post-traumatic growth is about more than just resiliency, because resiliency has to do with moving kind of forward, like getting through, if you will. Resiliency is about getting through what happened. Post-traumatic growth is about moving beyond who you were even before the trauma happened. It's about moving beyond who you were before the trauma happened. So that's kind of the transformative part of it. And as such, the definition then is more applicable to adults than to children. So, and it's because children, they just haven't lived long enough to kind of have much of a before and after. And their brains are still developing, through to like age 24, 25. So that idea of perspective taking and the bigger picture, it's hard to know how much of it is just natural developmental changes versus the trauma leading to this change in perspective. Whereas for adults, you can kind of track it more readily. So it is the post-traumatic growth is something that people don't always just enter into on purpose. They don't just say, okay, I'm going to do post-traumatic growth right now. Rather, it is something that it's a journey they find themselves on. So they don't really enter into it on purpose. They just kind of find themselves on this journey of post-traumatic growth. And that's because it is that effort to survive that leads them along that path. So here are the 5 domains of post-traumatic growth. And you can kind of compare them to the 6 ways that I mentioned earlier that the Black women in the study kind of found their path. So the first domain of post-traumatic growth is a greater appreciation of life, and a changed sense of priorities. So what people who experience trauma would say is they would comment about how after they got through the trauma, Small things had greater meaning. So people would say things like, the sky seemed bluer, or they felt really lucky to kind of make it out. And they took more time to appreciate life's small pleasures, things that they would have kind of taken for granted before. I guess they kind of take less for granted. And so that kind of makes sense. And that kind of tracks a little bit with what the Black women spoke about too, is that they kind of felt lucky to have survived, and they felt lucky to be safe, and they felt blessed beyond measure. They had a safe space for themselves and for their children, and that they were able to kind of get things that other people didn't have. So there is a greater appreciation for life. So that is a part of post-traumatic growth that they were able to replicate in the study. The second thing was warmer, more intimate relationships with others. Warmer, more intimate relationships with others. So some of the people just in the general study on post-traumatic growth said that they found out who their real friends were. And so the people that kind of stuck with them through the hard times, they developed stronger bonds with those people. And then also, some people felt like they had a greater empathy for other people that had similar experiences to them. So whereas before the trauma, they may have just kind of maybe not even thought about it. But after having the trauma, now they kind of pay particular attention to other people that have gone through the same thing or are going through the same thing that they went through. And they feel more empathy towards those people. So they feel, again, this empathic connection with them. So there's this warmer relationships with other people. And with the study with the Black women, there's kind of a little bit of both, right? Because the women kind of mentioned, particularly in the motherhood bond, that they felt like they could talk with other mothers and kind of connect. And also, they talked about their connection with their children. However, in the study with the Black American women at the shelter, they also cited solitude, where they were trying to kind of pull away from social relationships. So there were some differences there where they pulled away for self-preservation reasons. And again, we can debate, is it an overcompensation that's unhelpful, or is it actually helpful to kind of pull away and kind of have some introspection? So number 3, the third one, is a greater sense of personal strength. A greater sense of personal strength was a general factor for post-traumatic growth. People felt more confident in their ability to handle tough things. They felt more confident in their ability to handle tough things, and their perspective kind of changed such that things that used to feel like a big deal didn't seem as big anymore. Because when you've gone through something as big as a trauma you've gone through, then all of a sudden, these other things that seemed so big before now seem minor in comparison to what you've been through. So people tend to have this change in perspective that all these things that used to seem so big, not as big as a trauma that you went through. The interesting thing that the authors found, though, was that even along with this sense of personal strength, people tended to experience a great sense of vulnerability all at the same time. So they had great vulnerability and great strength at the same time. I guess with the women, the Black women in the study, they did, I think they didn't specifically mention personal strength. I think in this particular point was not kind of directly covered in that study, but one could say that their efforts at self-reliance were ways that that kind of made them feel empowered and maybe gave them some strength. So I don't think this one maybe contradicts. It's just that it wasn't directly reported in the study with the Black women. So number 4 is recognition of new possibilities. Recognition of new possibilities or new paths for your life. And I thought this one was interesting. The example that was given in the study was the example of a woman who makes it through her own struggle with grief and loss. And she decides to become an oncology nurse to work with people that have cancer. So she's helping other people going through suffering and loss. And what she says is she would never have considered that career path before. But having gone through that transformative experience of her own trauma, she's now seen this new possibility, this new path for what she can do with her life based on her own experiences. So this is another way that like post-traumatic growth is not just resilience. It's not just making it through the trauma. It's moving beyond who you were before you experienced the trauma. So in this case, this woman, she's moved beyond who she was before the trauma. Before, she would not have considered being an oncology nurse. And now is this the path that she's chosen. So that's kind of one of the factors of post-traumatic growth. And then lastly, for post-traumatic growth is spiritual development. And so many of the people in the original studies said that they felt that God helped them to get through that time in their lives. And then for people that maybe did not have a religious faith, they still maybe grappled with like existential questions that helped them to draw meaning. Overall, what they found was that the tough questions, the spiritual doubt, that the idea of kind of like having spiritual doubt or questions often tended to lead into a deeper faith in the long run. So spiritual development seemed to be one of the factors for post-traumatic growth. And that tracks with the Black women in the original study that also cited spirituality in their church community. For the point about the recognition of new possibilities, the study with the Black women also didn't specifically state that the women were talking about new possibilities or new paths for their life. They didn't directly state that, but it also didn't contradict that either. So that is the original, that is kind of the original study. I wanted to also mention a few other things, and this is more about your chances of experiencing post-traumatic growth, because I know sometimes, people that are listening may have gone through trauma and they may wonder what, are they going to be able to get through this? And so I wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about three things. There were three things that the authors mentioned as factors that contribute to post-traumatic growth. And so as you hear these three factors, think about whether or not any of them apply to you, because these are things that can help you with post-traumatic growth. Number one was personality. The authors found that people who were open to new experiences tended to have more post-traumatic growth. And this is kind of like this idea of being open to the fact that things may be different. So you're open to new experiences. You're kind of more adaptable to change. You tend to be more likely to experience post-traumatic growth. But also, they found that people who are more extroverted, and I kind of just interpret that as you are more comfortable engaging with your social networks. You're more comfortable engaging with your social circles. You're more willing to engage socially. They were also more likely to experience post-traumatic growth. And that makes sense. If you are more likely to engage with supportive people, you're more likely to experience post-traumatic growth. But again, this is interesting because with the Black women in the study, again, going back to the solitude thing, a lot of them were withdrawing, which by this original study should kind of be a negative factor that if you're not connecting with people, you're less likely to experience growth. But the Black women cited that as something that was helpful to them. So again, another one of those ways that you think, okay, is this different for people in different circumstances? But again, it's not too contradictory because the Black women still connected with their social circles. So they still connected with church and they connected with family. I think they just withdrew in certain social circumstances. So again, just something to kind of think about, talk about the balance between avoidance versus connection with your social circles. So that's the first thing the authors cited as factors contributing to post-traumatic growth is personality, being open to new experiences, and being kind of more extroverted. And the other thing was they said that people that have these kind of personality traits, they tend to be more likely to be aware of positive emotions, even in the time of adversity. Think about people who their brain kind of defaults to being able to see both positive and negative things in a situation rather than filtering out all the positive and just seeing the negative. So that person who, at the time of a natural disaster, when the news is just posting pictures of everybody in despair, that person is looking in the background to see who's helping. Let me look out for those helpers. Let me be the one to help. They're looking for the positive side of things. You're finding the silver lining. If you're one of those people that your brain tends to default to looking for the good things in a situation and you're kind of adaptable. So like maybe you weren't able to do this other thing, but then you can find the advantage in having that door close. And in that way, they mentioned that, like optimism is it's not a strong predictor of post-traumatic growth, but it's what they call like a weak predictor of post-traumatic growth. So it helps to influence it, but not to a very high degree. All right. So the second thing that you can think about in your journey through post-traumatic growth is management of distressing emotions. So how do you mentally process distress, right? When trauma occurs, your responses are likely to be somewhat automatic. And afterwards, you're going to have a lot of intrusive trauma-related thoughts, right? These things kind of happen automatically. Now, over time, some people just appear to have a more effective way of processing their trauma response. It's a way that allows them to let go of previous goals and previous assumptions, to let go of that feeling of disbelief of like, I can't believe this happened to me, and to be able to work on new goals. And what they mean by that is a lot of times in your life, you had like old goals and plans and things like that. Then a trauma happens, a car accident or a house fire or something, and you're in this place of disbelief. Now, if you stay in the place of disbelief and you keep holding on to all the old goals and the old plans that you have, then that can hinder post-traumatic growth. The people that tend to grow tend to be people that can forge new pathways, kind of like that woman who became the oncology nurse. She was able to forge a new pathway and let go of whatever her previous goals were. People that are able to shift and adapt to that kind of change, they are more likely to experience post-traumatic growth. This study also talks about mentally engaging in like thinking about and processing the trauma that can lead to growth. And so this study kind of doesn't really promote suppressing trauma thoughts, which again, the Black women in the first study, they cited suppressing the trauma thoughts as a factor that helped them in post-traumatic growth. This study is saying, actually, you know, what you want to do is process the thoughts in a productive way. So again, this might not necessarily be contradictory if you are receiving therapy. So you have a place to bring those thoughts to, and you can process it effectively with a licensed therapist. But then maybe in your day-to-day life, you don't want to dwell on those thoughts all the time. You want to kind of try to not think about it all day long. So I think you can find a balance with that. But again, it's just really interesting to kind of think about the different answers that we get in different populations. Because we know that like rumination can worsen mental health, right? Rumination can cause things like depression. But the women in the study, when they tried to kind of like suppress the thoughts, they did actually experience the thoughts less often over time. So interesting, right? So again, are these kinds of recommendations universal for all people, or are there ways in which different people groups have slightly different angles at which they kind of find their path to post-traumatic growth? Okay, so the last one is support and disclosure. Support and disclosure. Supportive people can help to prompt your perspective about your life experiences. You know, some of you have had the experience of like you're struggling with something, you talk to a friend and they ask you a question that makes you stop and think. They ask you a question or they make a statement that helps to change your perspective. People that have that kind of support, they are also more likely to experience post-traumatic growth. The other part of it too is that, so that's the support, but then there's also the disclosure. And that has to do with, who do you tell your story to? Okay, so you might tell your story to a therapist. When you tell your story to other people, you start to form a narrative, and you can use this story or this narrative to connect with people. You connect with people who have maybe experienced similar things. You can connect with people who haven't experienced it, but maybe you want to teach them how to avoid experiencing what you went through. Or maybe you just want to share your story. And sometimes it's therapeutic just to let it out, to let it go, to tell your narrative. So how many of you out there have shared your story, or you've heard someone else share their story? Okay, I'd be interested to know what that was like for you. So post-traumatic growth is both an ongoing process and an outcome. It's not just an outcome, it's something people continue to go through. It's a journey. And growth is not the same thing as well-being. Okay, just to say that. And also, post-traumatic growth, I've been talking about it all this whole time about the individual level of the person, but post-traumatic growth can also be expanded from the level of the individual to a group of people. So if you have a group of people that have experienced a hardship, like a collective of people, now that group can also experience post-traumatic growth as a collective, and they can form a new identity following a trauma, kind of like a group of Black people who have gone through the trauma of slavery. They come out of that trauma, and they, as a collective, are experiencing post-traumatic growth and forming a new identity and going through changes of mindset and transformation. That can happen at the group level too. Okay. And there's also, just like we talk about support and disclosure, there can be the group telling of stories and narratives, like a collection of narratives that we tell to each other and to those outside the circle and so on. So there can be a group form of post-traumatic growth. So this is what I wanted to talk to you about today regarding healing from trauma. I hope that this has been helpful to somebody. And there are some points that maybe, we can kind of debate or talk about, what things contribute to growth, what things are adaptive or not adaptive. But all the points for both of the studies, these relate to people's actual lived experiences. So you can argue with it if you will, but these are how people reported for themselves that they experienced post-traumatic growth. And so these are, both of the studies had quotes from like real people saying that this is what they thought and experienced. So what are some of the ways that you have grown after experiencing a hardship? Drop a comment below, share your wisdom so that others can benefit. And definitely join me again next week for Black Mental Health Matters, Sundays at 1 p.m. on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. So take care.